Well, good afternoon, friends. We'll begin. I imagine some folks will continue to filter in. My name is Mike Ogaturk. I'm a second-generation settler of Dutch descent living on unceded Algonquin territory. I'm also party to the two-world wampum covenant between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee, which is one reason I'm super excited to be here with Joe today, because we're going to talk about wampum. I'll just read Joe's bio. Joe Maxwell is a Aquinnah Wampanoag, born and raised in Iowa. Joe is a recent graduate of the U of Iowa's School of Planning and Public Affairs, where he earned a master's degree in urban planning, urban and regional planning. Last summer, Joe served as an intern with the USDA Office of Tribal Relations, where he participated in meetings between USDA leadership and tribal governments, and developed a tool to track co-stewardship agreements between the U.S. Forest Service and tribal nations. There's a story there. He also worked as a research assistant with the University of Iowa's Native Policy Lab, supporting Mellon-funded initiatives including Project Trust and Project Return. Currently, Joe has accepted a fellowship at Portland, and I can't read my own writing.
Portland State University.
Portland State, that's right. Department, and he'll be working with the Department of Environmental Quality. So, Joe, welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Is my microphone on?
Believe so, yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you all for being here. Choosing to come to this presentation. I know there are a lot of them happening simultaneously. I think I want to start also by sharing that as a recent student, around the 3:30 time for classes was always a dangerous time for me. So if I start to see any nodding off, I've been there, that's been me. Don't feel ashamed about it at all. I think the message will weave its way in. And good work to the front row warriors. That's right. So today, I don't want to start with any theories, but actually with a place. A shoreline. Shorelines are these places that's not necessarily land, but it's also not sea. It's where two worlds are in a constant conversation, where the boundary is always moving. When the tide comes in, what was dry becomes wet, and when it's pulled out, what was submerged is revealed. And I want to propose that the shoreline is where governance actually lives. Not in documents or courtrooms, but at the shoreline of our sensory experience. It's in this liminal space where different worlds encounter one another. And when we learn to see it there, I find, in my own personal experience, that something awakens in us. A political awareness that is larger than any party's platform. It's maybe something that almost doesn't fit the word political at all. So, as Mike just said, my name is Joe Maxwell, and I am here today at the NAIITS conference telling stories, sharing research, and offering my perspective on the shoreline with you. I'm an enrolled member of the Wampanoag tribe of Aquinnah, as well as a recent graduate from the University of Iowa. Now, this is my first time at a NAIITS conference, and I'm so grateful to be here with you all. It's actually kind of a fun story. My great-great-grandmother, Elsie Briscoe, is from the city of Halifax. And this is the first time anyone from my family has visited her birthplace. So I'm grateful for Chris and for NAIITS for creating this path to reconnect with my ancestors at the Being a Good Ancestor conference. Now, this presentation I'm going to share with you all today lives at the intersection of legal theory, indigenous studies, and a newer discipline called the Blue Humanities. An emerging field that takes water and not land as the primary lens for understanding our culture, politics, and relationships. It asks, what happens to how we think about law and sovereignty when we take the ocean or rain as the starting place rather than the map or the fence? Now, we've built most of our political imagination on solid ground with territory, boundaries, and lines that stay put. And the Blue Humanities asks, what is this orientation missing? You see, the shoreline is not a problem to be solved. It's not a wound between land and sea that's waiting to be healed. It's a generative place, one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet precisely because of the meeting of these two worlds, the flux, the in-betweenness of it all. So what are these two worlds? Well, you have the above ground world, where we are standing right now, breathing air. This is another view of the Aquinnah Cliffs and the Aquinnah shoreline, taken a little bit more inland just to show the beautifully diverse ecosystems that the shoreline give us access to. And then you also have the vast underwater worlds that extend for thousands of miles beyond the shore. Through rivers, streams, and seas, this world connects coral reefs in the Red Sea to the shorelines of Aquinnah and even here in Wolfville. And the beautiful thing about this world is these above ground and underwater worlds exist simultaneously. I'm actually kind of friends with that sea turtle in that picture. We were just talking the other day. He's going to a conference in Reefville, all about reptilian theology. So I can't wait to connect with him after this conference. Now, in the dominant legal tradition, a treaty is a written agreement between political authorities, which defines trade, territory, and jurisdiction. They're stored in archives and only taken out in times of conflict. But we all know treaties have an older life than that. Long before European contact, Native nations developed treaty making through ceremony, gift-giving, feasting, storytelling. Treaties were relational and living technologies. They recorded encounters, oriented future meetings, and required constant renewal. Now, in 1613, the two-row wampum belt was gifted by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to Dutch settlers, using wampum, a shell that is found at the shoreline. The two parallel purple rows represent two vessels on the same river, neither steering into the other's canoe, bound by a shared commitment to non-interference. Now, notice what this agreement doesn't do. It doesn't fix any territory or transfer any land. Rather, it established a relationship and a way of being sitting right beside each other. And within Haudenosaunee law, it wasn't a historic moment, but rather the beginning of an ongoing relationship. And those principles remain legally and ethically operative today, because treaties in this tradition are living and not archived. Now, something that I just like to share with people, especially people who come from a dominant legal perspective, a settler legal perspective, is that this was actually the first formal agreement between peoples from two existing legal and relational worlds. So in my legal imagination, how I imagine justice working out, I see this really as settlers being invited into a native way of adjudicating justice. And this is a justice system that still lives today. And when I look out and see this community of spiritual leaders, I see a group of people who dwell at the shoreline, between traditionally native and Christian worldviews. So I imagine a lot of the frameworks that I'll be sharing today just kind of come as second nature, kind of like a duh moment for a lot of us. And I'm so grateful for that. So the question of how we see this awareness and then share it with the people thousands of miles inland and then the turtles thousands of miles out to sea is why I brought this presentation to the NAIITS conference today. So let's talk about nationhood, sovereignty, and responsibility. To start, we actually will begin at the river to show how water really exceeds containment. Now in my paper and in this presentation, my thinking is informed by an Indian scholar named Dilip Dacuna, who argues that the body of water we are quick to call a river is actually a construct invented by humans. Now, the other day I was sitting by the Iowa River, and I had my Google Maps app open on my phone. And I don't know if you all have ever noticed, but if you try it out for yourself, sit by a river and look at a river on the map at the same time, the thin blue line on the map really reduces this flowing body that has a width, a depth, and its own unique character, and to just that, a thin blue line. He calls these lines imposed on the landscape lines of flow. Now, to remain coherent, worldviews that rely on lines of flow to describe phenomena require what Dacuna calls the flow of lines, which is the continuous revision of what we know to reflect what we see. The flow of lines is documented in this picture right here from 1941. All those colorful ghost paths are areas that the Mississippi River has flowed over generations. Now, Dacuna argues in his book, The Invention of Rivers, that a fixed line on a map is always a fiction that is imposed on something that is inherently fluid. Now, I come from the great state of Iowa, the only state in the United States where both our east and west borders are defined by rivers. So what does this flowing nature of what we call rivers impact how our nations and political boundaries flow? Well, in Iowa's case, what's actually happened is the boundary set in 1847 when the state was established. On the west side of the river, the Missouri River has meandered so much that there's actually an Iowan community that is in what would now be called Nebraska. It's just a little small neighborhood by the airport. Now, on this slide, I want to pause with the image that we see. At first, it looks like just like any other water cycle diagram that we might have seen in school. But it doesn't move in the clean sequence that a lot of us have learned, where evaporation turns into condensation, precipitation, then collection. Rather, it feels messier and almost more alive. At the top, we see the title, Moments of Ephemerality, which are clouds in humidity, rain, dew, mist, and moisture. These are fleeting forms of water that appear and then disappear, gather, disperse, and then return. They're real and really difficult to hold. You can't draw a firm boundary around mist or point to humidity like a line on a map. Now at the bottom, we see time of reality, and this is the realm that the colonial worldview is really used to. This is the realm of maps and memories, infrastructure, and future design. It's how we make the world legible. Here's the river, here's the boundary, the road, and the archive. But what I love about this image, and what I love about the shoreline, is that it doesn't separate these two views of time. The arrows show movement between them. Ephemeral moments become part of reality, as reality is constantly revised by ephemeral moments. Rain becomes flood, moisture becomes erosion, and water exceeds the categories we use to contain it. And this is where Dacuna is helpful. A map can draw a river as a line, but it cannot hold the full life of water. And this matters for treaties. Colonial law treats treaties often as these fixed objects, a date, a document, a boundary, or a map. Those matter, for sure, but they don't hold the full life of the relationship. Treaty relationships also live in the fleeting encounters, with ceremonies and gifts, apologies, and silences. So when I call treaties a shoreline technology, I'm asking both of us to hold these both together. Both the recorded reality of what was signed, drawn, and remembered, and also the living moments where relationship keeps returning. Now, if our political imagination is built entirely on fixed lines, we will keep missing the quintessence. We'll keep missing that governance is happening in the governance that flows. Now I'm going to transition a little bit from the geographic to the social. With the help of the Pacific scholar Epeli Hau'ofa, who reframes this essential quality of water into the movement of people. In Our Sea of Islands, he describes the Pacific Ocean not as this vast ocean that separates these tiny, weak dots of islands like the maps do, but rather he sees the Pacific Ocean as this medium that connects these interconnected cultures. He also mentions that happening simultaneously in the world, just like how you have an above ground and underwater world, you have simultaneous political and relational realities. Political realities are centered on nation states and boundaries, trade and diplomatic relations, while a relational reality is a lot more microscopic than that. It is the movement of families who have been promised these big promises by political bodies, also understand that they can't necessarily count on political bodies to support them in their everyday life. So go through the daily routine of trading with other families, no matter if they share the same nationality. He tells the story of a Tongan man in his work who travels between the countries of Tonga, Fiji, and we'll call California a country for all intents and purposes, carrying the goods and maintaining relationships across these boundaries. Now, technically, to the political world, he's an economic migrant, but relationally, he's something that's a lot more older and sovereign. He's sustaining kinship across water. Now, what I just find fascinating is that the water in both these worldviews is the same. The question is whether you see it as a barrier or a medium. Relational sovereignty isn't a soft claim, but it's a more accurate description of how political life actually works. It works through conversations and everyday relationships. And this is something our ancestors knew and it passed down to us. If you see a map of what political sovereignty looked like on Turtle Island before lines were imposed on it, what you'll see is this huge mess of overlapping sovereignties as people migrated. These overlapping jurisdictions that look really chaotic to a settler perspective, but actually maintain a coherence, and a coherence that settler perspectives have difficulty maintaining, a coherence across time. This doesn't have to be revised as people move around. Now, I'm going to shift a little bit into the relationship between Native nations, the United States, within the United States' legal system. In 2009, just about 15 years ago, the United States offered an apology to Native nations, which was buried in the most appropriate of places, a defense appropriations bill. It was never read aloud by President Barack Obama. It wasn't actually formally delivered to Native nations at all. Now, Layli Long Soldier wrote a book of poetry called Whereas in response to what she sees as this misjustice. And she turned the legal language of the apology back on itself and showed us that while legal language uses words like whereas to connect legal statements, it does a very poor job at connecting people relationally. It can say the word whereas and then really just mean nothing. So what did she do? She didn't write a better legal document, but rather wrote a poem that requires a different kind of reading. This poem here has words arranged in multiple directions with no single direction that says this is the way to read it. The act of reading it becomes a relational act, proving that words can become a shoreline technology. This is how you see the space in which to place me. The space in me you see is this place. To see this space, see how you place me in you. This is how to place you in the space in which to see. I just love that poem. I love imagining if it was like placed horizontally on a table and you had a different interpreter sitting out all the four directions. Each one would carry away a completely different meaning. And it just shows really how language, which we think can only be interpreted in one way, really is interpreted by the people who receive it and in what part of the room they're receiving it from. Now, I'm going to shift this conversation of treaty responsibility into a land-based practice by asking us to think about beavers and the dams that they create. Beavers interrupt flow and slow waters creating wetlands. Now, a long time ago, not actually a long time ago, like a couple generations ago, settler economies once treated this as an obstruction and hunted the beavers nearly to extinction. You know, the settler sciences are starting to catch up and understand what we Native people have known for a long time with our PhDs in environmental science, that beaver dams are some of the most ecologically generative forces that can happen in a landscape. When you pool the water behind the dam, you actually create new conditions for different types of life to show up. And Leanne Simpson argues that indigenous blockades actually operate in a very similar way, where they don't only stop the colonial pressures, but through redirecting flow, they actually create the conditions for a cultural resurgence and indigenous legal practice that reasserts itself in space behind the blockade. Which ceremony at a blockade? Dance at the site of violence. This is not only resistance. This right here is treaties being lived in communities and in bodies. Now, treaty making at the shoreline, what does it look like? I like to hold in my heart that the two-row wampum belt is treaty. The book by Long Soldier, Whereas, is treaty. A shared meal across differences is treaty. Maybe even a 23-year-old philosophizing in front of a semi-sleepy group of audience members is treaty too. All of these are attempts to navigate the shoreline between coexisting domains without fixing the relationship into static form. Here's some examples I've listed of how treaties show up in my life and can maybe show up in your life too, with art, music, and poetry, meals, economic exchanges. They're all sites where relational sovereignty is either enacted, appreciated, or abandoned. We are all governing right now in whatever story we choose to take out of this room, what we choose to remember. So I'm going to bring it all back to the two-row wampum. I have two canoes, one river, and the promise that neither canoe will steer into the other. Now, centuries of dispossession and assimilation of native people have taken us pretty far away from these original terms. Some might say, it's completely crashed. But I understand a return to 1613 isn't possible. But what's beautiful, and what I hope we can all see now today, is that native people have kept holding space at the shoreline through blockades and poetry, ceremony and wampum. The invitation remains open to all of us. And I'll close out with just a small image, one that I hope stays. Imagine you're holding a two-row wampum belt in your hand. This is one that I made sitting beside my friend who has Dutch ancestry. If you feel its weight, you can ask yourself, what's the most important element of this belt that I'm holding? Someone with a settler worldview might look at the beads and notice the beads as the most important part. Well, they're currency. Without the beads, you don't have a belt. Which could be true. But I believe that my native ancestors held the same belt and saw something else as the most important element, and that's the string that holds them all together. Without the string, the belt just becomes a pile of scattered beads. And this difference in vision is everything. Each time native and settler worldviews meet at the shoreline, something sacred occurs. A bead is co-created. A treaty is co-created. And those two people who have held the same bead and seen something different. Settlers tend to see a discrete agreement, bounded and separate, while my ancestors took the same bead and threaded it onto something older and longer. A story of coexistence, rupture, and respect, and lives that live alongside each other across generations. That string, this string, running beneath it all, begins with the two-row wampum, the first treaty of this land, and still, hundreds of years later, the most honest one. we're holding this belt, all of us. I'm holding the physical one, but we all have belts in our hearts. And the question is whether we can finally agree as a microcosm of the world we belong to on what makes it whole. Thank you.
Around the replica.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
Made by Kenny Wallace, as was this. I could go in so many directions, Joe. Your work here on the liminal space of the shoreline also echoes some of the work of John Morrow's and his really important work, Laws of Indigenous Ethic, where he talks about the way indigenous communities learn their ethic in their land, and then as they step into borderlands, the liminal spaces of the shoreline, they begin an experience of sharing their ethics and building treaty in relationships. So that resonance was really cool. One of the things that I've often heard about wampum, and I think you've alluded to this, is that it's a living document. Even kin is a word that's used in some of the scholarship and teaching. Wonder how you interact with that idea of living kin.
Well, I'm raised in the Wampanoag tribe, Wampum, Wampanoag. It was members of my tribe who would sit at the shore and harvest the shells from the quahog shells. And I guess what I can share is maybe a little intimate. It's a piece of jewelry I wear every day. It's just a little wampum bead here on my wrist. I promise it's there. It's hard to see from far away. But yeah, wampum as living kin, when we have like the physical, actual bead with us, it's so much easier to remember the stories that are told about it. In my worldview, everything carries a spirit. Wampum carries a spirit, chairs carry a spirit, tables. And when I touch something that on its inside and outside is wampum, it carries with it all the stories that I've heard about it. So I'm curious, thank you for that question. Do you have anything to add?
So just reflecting on actually what we talked about earlier, the Tua wampum tradition has actually transitioned into a significant legal and constitutional tradition here in Canada, and that's represented by the covenant chain. And that covenant chain is actually, it's a living, breathing tradition, because when the covenant chain was a means of paying attention to the relationship and coming together to polish the silver chain, to pay attention to the relationship and the covenant made. That covenant still has legal import in Canada today, as actually underlined by a significant Quebec Superior Court decision just recently. So the living legal reality, unfortunately, is not nearly as present in the lived organic treaty that you so beautifully talked about. But because the courts are remembering, I think that's testament to the fact that these wampum as kin, as living testimonies, still have something to say to us in our relationships.
I'm so grateful that the courts are kind of stepping into that relational world, for everyone's benefit, but I think first and foremost for the court's benefit.
A lot of that stepping in is based on oral tradition as a significant legal input in Canadian work. So it's really interesting times. I'd love to open up the floor to your questions and reflections, friends. What do you have for Joe? Yeah.
I was wondering if you can reflect a bit. You said something at the beginning, and so I'm just trying to see how it weaves into some of your thought. But so I've lived here since 2003, and one of the things that shapes the soul of an East Coaster, especially right here, is the Bay of Fundy tides, which are the highest in the world. And in particular, the fact that you said earlier the shoreline is changing. It's always changing. And I realize that's always true of a shoreline in some way. Here, that literally means very visibly, every time I go over there, I can see a difference. I have people in my church who had to move buildings back because the shore is taking the land. So the change is what I'm wondering about. You kind of said that at the outset.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's a bit of tension in saying treaties exist and they're still valid, and saying, in this context, shores are moving.
Yeah. I think that change is the most important element of a treaty. Where when the shoreline moves, you see so many different things. When it goes back, you might find bones that were buried underneath the water. And, treaties, I think in the past, in the way, at least how I've felt them in the past, before I began really engaging treaties from like a different perspective, I saw them as like, if the shoreline's always changing, it just drew a line on like the average between the shoreline. It said this average between the water and the land is where the boundaries are. Which, just for me as someone living in the world, isn't satisfying. I love that change. I love the flux. The idea that, when people move, they take their culture with them. And, the Bay of Fundy, I was just reading up on it, actually, earlier. There's a sign that's out there by some of the mud marshes. And, I feel like if there's one place in the world where you can really see that change, that flow of people represented through the flow of water, it's here. So, really grateful for it.
So I have just a simple question. You put the poem was written in an interesting way. Could you tell me who the poet is and the name of the poem again?
So that's Layli Long Soldier. And it's from her collection of poems, Whereas. And the poem is called 3. And if you'd like to see the book, I actually have it in my backpack. So. Layli is spelled Layle.
Thanks for that as well. So I had misspelled that. Danny, your point on that movement, and yours too. Yeah, just hearing this and thinking about, I've done a lot of reading in place theory and in geography, and this has echoes of that in your planning background. And postmodern place theory, someone like Doreen Massey would challenge the notion that place traditionally would talk about being rooted in place, right, roots, and to talk about not R-O-O-T-S, but R-O-U-T-E-S, right, that in a kind of a postmodern deconstruction, you can think about place in a different way, and it is much more fluid. So I think about that a lot.
Fluid dynamics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just a connection when you are talking to each other. I thought of that too. There's interesting twists there.
Yeah, roots versus roots, R-O-U-T-S. yeah, that beautiful idea of like you can see echoes of where people have been based off of the imprint they've left on the landscape. Yeah, thanks for bringing some of that flavor into the conversation. I think this conversation too is something that a lot of my aunties in Iowa City would probably, hit me over the head if I didn't mention something about it. But it's the difference between masculine and feminine worldviews, where masculine worldviews are. In the Blue Humanities, you'll read a lot of feminist literature. Some people even call themselves post-human feminists, which I'm still trying to figure out what that means. But you'll read a lot of feminist literature that kind of talks a lot about how the nature of being a woman living in the world is one that's very fluid, very relational. We all come from a woman. We all come from fluid, the umbilical fluid. So, when I think about the first settlers who kind of came to Turtle Island, Christopher Columbus, and just reflect on how they were all men. The question I like to ask myself is just like, what hidden gender biases did they bring with them? And how can I listen to the women in my life to start to tell a different story?
Other questions or reflections?
I'd just like to say thank you for sharing your talk. I think there's a lot of things that I've been thinking about that you touched on, so I just appreciate your perspective that you shared. Especially, I'm from originally Thunder Bay, which sits on Lake Superior, and so I remember back when I was feeling angsty in art school, I did a poster about how you can't deport, no shade to the Americans, you can't deport pollution, and just thinking about kind of what does shared collective responsibility look like to a body of water when you say own, in a sense that border comes through, but they're the water, it's one body of water. And so, yeah, it's an interesting concept to then broaden to about all aspects of our humanity is shared in a way that, you can be taught from a young age. It's in a box in its own. Whereas, yeah, as you can see, the rivers, they move and they migrate throughout history as well. So, yeah.
I love the Thunder Bay area.
Yes, it's so beautiful.
Yes, I had one of my most satisfying hikes along the coast there a couple of
nice.
springs ago.
Cool. Which part?
Oh, I think it was Little Trout Bay, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's familiar or if it sounds like something completely
Yeah,
different.
little trout bays. Yeah. And I just wanted to ask, what made you choose this picture of this place to start with? Because as you said, you wanted to share a place versus a theory.
Oh, thank you so much for asking this question. It's a place that's reflected here on my medallion too. And if you didn't ask the question, I wouldn't have been able to bring it up and talk about a place that's close to my spirit. But yeah, this shoreline that keeps coming back is the Quina Cliffs out in the Wampanoag territory. White people these days call it Martha's Vineyard, but the name that it's been for much longer is Nompi. So this shoreline in particular, I've had many fires. I've been out there with family, with friends, with youth that I've had the opportunity to mentor. So when I was thinking about a shoreline that was the most meaningful to me, I decided to choose this one. But I hope as you see it, it conjured images of whatever shoreline's the most meaningful to you. Well, thank you all for giving your listening ears. I don't think I saw anyone nodding off, so take that as a win. And I'm so excited to, yeah, just continue engaging these concepts with the other presentations.
Let's